Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for Civil Society's webinar on the nuns. And by nuns, I don't mean the nuns that taught me at St. Barnabas, the Sisters of Charity, or the Sweet Sisters of Life, or the Sisters of the Dominican Sisters of the Sick Poor. No, I mean the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who have difficulties, problems with religious affiliation in America. And we believe that too in itself may be a problem. A declining worship poses, we believe, some of us believe, we'll find out what the experts believe, threats to American civil society. So we're very blessed today to have two real experts on the meaning of religious worship, its consequence to America, the actual numbers, like what is actually happening. And that's Daniel Cox and Mary Eberstadt. And I'm going to, we'll proceed this way. I'm going to read their bios in alphabetical order. Well, I should mention who I am. I'm Jack Fowler. I'm the senior fellow at the Center for Civil Society, and I host our monthly webinar series. I will give an introduction also, and then we'll go back and forth with Mary and Daniel on various questions that I've written. But if you have questions, you see on the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a Q&A function. Feel free to toss up a question, and I'll get to it, and I'll pose it to our expert panelists. So I thank them very much for being here today. It means a lot. Daniel Cox is Senior Fellow in Polling and Public Opinion at the American Enterprise Institute and the director of its Survey Center on American Life. He specializes in survey research, politics, youth culture, and identity, and religion. Before joining AEI, he was the research director at the Public Religion Research Institute, which he co-founded, and where he led the organization's qualitative and quantitative research program. He's the co-author of numerous academic book chapters, journal articles, and conference papers on topics relating to religious polarization, anti-Muslim attitudes in the U.S., religious tolerance of atheists, new methods for measuring social class and religious belief. His work is frequently featured in the popular press, including The Atlantic, CNN, and The Washington Post. And I have to add National Review. He's a contributor to 538 and Business Insider, and he holds a PhD and a master's in American government from Georgetown University, where he focused on public opinion, political behavior, and religion and politics. And Mary Eberstadt, Mary holds the Panula Chair in Christian Culture at the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C., and she's also a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute. She's an American writer whose contributions to the intellectual landscape traverse genres. She's an essayist, a novelist, a playwright too. Yes, Mary, do you have a play here?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, all right. And she's a frequent public speaker, author of several books of nonfiction, including How the West Really Lost God, A New Theory of Secularization, which I have here, and maybe we'll quote from. Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics, and Adam and Eve and the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. She has other books too. Her social commentary draws from fields including anthropology, intellectual history, philosophy, popular culture, sociology, and theology. And central to Mary's diverse interests are questions concerning the philosophy and culture of Western civilization and the fate and aspirations of postmodern man. So we have, for the topic at hand, which is a pretty darn important topic, we have two people who can really take it on and give it greater meaning and hopefully give us a fuller understanding and maybe even drive us deeper into despair about what is happening in the world. So I want to begin with Daniel. Daniel, for a lot of us, news about the decline in religiosity, the nuns, comes through news stories. Gallup poll survey says, so let me just draw on two Gallup surveys one from, I think it's 2021, So it's a question. It asks, how important would you say religion is in your own life? And for a long time, from I would say 1993 to about 2005, there was kind of a balance there of 57% to 61% answer that question. Yeah, religion is very important to my life. But at that point, the trend started down and down significantly, I think, given the period of time. And come 2021, only 49% of Americans are answering that as very important. So we have about a 12-point drop from over 25-year period. On the flip side, people who say it is not important has doubled from 12% over that initial first period to 2021. A fairly important sort of stays consistent. And one other Gallup survey, Daniel, is about belief in God. So from 1944 till a decade ago, 90% of Americans said yes when asked, do you believe in God? And then the bottom fell out. Now the current numbers are 81% answer that question yes, which also means 1 in 5 Americans do not believe in God. That means so we're getting the question. We will get to the question, what exactly are the nones? And I think that's not an important factor. Like 1 in 5 people just don't believe in God at all. Now, you have written about this, Daniel, have a piece, and we're going to have a link up to that piece, why a modest decline in religious belief is important. Would you talk about these surveys? I know there was a Pew study also that kind of supports these general findings, but tell us about these kind of surveys, and do they really get to into the depth of the nones and these increasing numbers?
Yeah, so things get very complicated very quickly when you're dealing with religion and trying to measure religion. So I've been a public pollster that's focused on religion, politics, and culture for about a decade and a half now. And a lot of the top line figures that you see reported in the news from Gallup or Pew focus on religious affiliation. That's whether you affiliate with any major religious tradition, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, and you can ask about denominational affiliation as well, Methodist, Episcopalian, what have you. That's only one aspect of one's religious life or lack thereof. And a lot of their measures that you talked about just now, belief, religious salience, how important it is in your life, they're all showing kind of similar patterns, but some of that's more recent. So when we first saw an uptick of the nones in the early 90s, it was based on general social survey data. And basically in the mid 90s, we started seeing uptick, which accelerated in the early 2000s. But we're seeing similar trends happen across a variety of different measures. In fact, any way you want to measure religion, people are less religious on that measure than they were a couple decades earlier, which gives us some sense that this is not just people leaving a certain denomination or tradition, or that people are becoming unattached believers, that they retain attachment to organized religion and belief in a higher power or God, even if they're not regularly participants. The fact of the matter is we're seeing declines across the board. And that group of people who initially were identified as unattached believers tend to be unattached and at best apathetic believers. So it's they don't think about God a lot. God's not that important in their life. And so I think the picture it paints is that, large scale, pretty rapid, to be honest, secularization in the most sort of conventional definition of that term. And Pew actually did some really interesting forecasting of what religion is going to look like 30, 40 years down the road. And in every model they did, it's lower. The number of people who are identifying with a religious tradition is lower than it is today, without exception. And they took account of immigration and differential birth rates and death rates, religious change, all these different factors which demographers have to wrestle with, and they all sort of pointed in a different in the same direction, albeit the end result was a little bit different depending on how they sort of varied the estimates. But basically, yeah, I mean, I think that's the state of American religion in one sense. There's obviously, we could get into increasing religious diversity, and there's still vibrant religious communities all over the U.S. That's part of the story too. But I think like the headline is decline.
And of the close to majority that have accept a religious affiliation or claim a religious affiliation, do you find weakness in those numbers too? I mean, in your story, you said something to the effect that, well, I can't find it here readily now, but that the numbers just belie, they don't really tell the, I mean, you explain the story to some extent, but do you think there's even a weakness in the believers?
Yeah, for 100% sure. It was in, I think, the late 70s, 80s that surveys first started asking about doubts, religious doubting. Before that time, Gallup was asking about belief in God back in the 40s, and it was really, really stable. They just asked a yes or no question: do you believe in God or not? Yes or no. It was 98%, I think, when they were originally asking, and it dipped as low as like 96%, maybe during the subsequent decades. But then pollsters started querying folks about whether they ever had any doubts about their belief in God. And lo and behold, people actually, a significant number of people said that they had some doubts. We actually developed a measure here at AEI where we asked both doubting among believers and non-believers, and it turns out people doubt on both sides, but it's really significant. So we used a scale, 10-point scale to measure this, and we found that only slightly more than half of Americans both believe in God and have no doubts about that belief. The rest of the country either believes in God and has doubts or does not believe.
Mary, one of the things we want to talk about, and we'll get into some of the details Daniel raised a little later, any differences between age groups, because Daniel, you said don't blame the young, and we'll get into your thoughts on that area, and Christian, Jew, Catholic, even some of these breakdowns. But first of all, Mary, if there's anything I'm going to pose a question now, and you can answer it. But if you have any thoughts about what Daniel has said, you could add them on also. So, Mary, I think this webinar, our objective here today is to really assess at its core, what does all this mean for American civil society, which has lots of assumptions, and we believe civil society is vital to America as what America is. I mean, America is America. It's not France, not Greece, etc. And we have a very unique country in part because of our civil society. And the assumption is, or the presumption, is that a decline in religiosity and an increase in the nuns is going to harm our civil society. And I think another way that we could approach this is to have gone through the route you did in the book, which I just showed before, how the West really lost God, which you wrote in 2014, a new theory of secularization. And in that book, Mary, you, as you know, I'm telling you, you wrote this, but you wrote about the change in the family. So this is a central theme, not only I think to this book, but other things you've written about. And I'd like you to discuss that theme. What is the change of family? What does it mean to the nuns and then to civil society? And can we connect these dots? Family decline, ... nuns increase, ... civil society is weakened. Is that true? But talk about your theme and talk about that connection if it does indeed exist.
Yes, thank you, Jack. And I must say, as an author, it is gratifying to be able to talk about a book with someone who's actually read the book. I appreciate that. So let me do a little big picture work here. Secularization, all researchers agree, really started taking off in the West around 1963 to 1965. This is when we really see religious belief and practice go over a cliff. And this is true not only in the United States, but pretty much across the Western world. And it's a great mystery because it represents such a radical break with what went before. So what is causing this broad trend? In How the West Really Lost God, I look in some detail at the dominant theories of what's going on. So for example, there's a general theory that the West lost God because we got kind of fat and happy, prosperous and educated, and we just didn't need divinity anymore. This has a surface appeal, and I think it's what a lot of people intuitively believe to be correct, but it is falsified over and over by various facts, one of which is that in different times and societies that I document in the book, religious people are actually more likely to be concentrated at the top of the socioeconomic ladder, not the bottom. This is true, for example, of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the United States. It is true broadly of religious believers in the United States. People who have been to college are actually more likely to be found in religious organizations than people who haven't. So in other words, I don't think that going theory holds up well at all. There are other theories. Some people believe that the catastrophic experiences of the two world wars, for example, led many people to lose their religious faith. This too is a theory with intuitive appeal, but it too is falsified by the very intriguing fact that World War II was actually followed by a religious boom. Again, not only in the United States, but across the West. And this included in countries that had been neutral in the war, countries that were vanquished in the war, countries that were victorious in the war. Across the West, there was a boom in marriage immediately following the war, followed by the much more familiar baby boom, which was accompanied by a religious boom. So cutting to the chase, the theory advanced in the book is that secularization has not been well understood. What's really going on, I argue, is that the massive social changes that began with the widespread adoption of the birth control pill and related technologies had the effect of disrupting the family as it has never been disrupted before. Following the sexual revolution, we see abortions skyrocket, divorce skyrockets, cohabitation skyrockets, and the family patterns to which we're now very accustomed become the norm. Fatherlessness is now a kind of norm, for example. Small families are a norm. Families with only children are a norm. And I'm not singling out any particular family and pointing out these trends. The point instead is that we shrunk and fractured something that just might turn out to be essential, not only to individual well-being, but also to civil society. And so given that analysis, the argument amounts to saying that the sexual revolution weakened the family as never before, and thereby interrupted the transmission belt of religiosity itself. And I think it did this in a few different ways. For example, just as a prosaic matter, when families are split up and kids alternate between different homes, it's much harder to have consistent religious instruction, for instance.
Right.
Another example would be that religions like the Catholic Church that frown on divorce, that don't allow divorce, are suddenly faced with a situation where substantial numbers of their populations are divorced, that is, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, living in sin. People don't like to be told that they are in the wrong, but Christianity can't help sending that message given its fundamental moral code. So this is another kind of tension. And third, just to mention in passing, what may be the most important of all is that when we shrunk the family, when we took people out of the lives of other people inadvertently, when we as a society did this, it meant that the fundamental rhythms of birth, death, sacrifice, etc., became less and less familiar to people. There was less of a sense of participating in the sacred act of creation, for example. I mean, how do you even explain a thought like that to, say, a middle-aged woman who's never held a baby. This, I think, is what is really underneath these numbers on the nuns. It is the fact that younger people have seen very few models in their own lives, models of religious behavior, models of robust family behavior. And it is no wonder that they are postponing marriage, expressing fear of commitment, and all the rest, because these things are not innate, they are taught, and we have disrupted the most important mechanism that was teaching these things.
Mary, it's not like I wasn't listening to you, but that's like, so the family matters. As you said, I like the disruption of the family, although it could be the collapse of the family. I don't think that doesn't matter. I mean, it matters how we qualify what's going on, but you use disruption. So that's a factor. You have a book, Primal Screen, that's also about how the sexual revolution has disrupted things, obviously. Is it through the family that the through the disruption of the family that the sexual revolution maybe leads to this loss of religiosity, or is it its own factor independent?
Well, these things are related. I mean, let's take, for example, you asked about civil society and the effect of religiosity on civil society. The decline of Christianity among the young means, for example, that the very idea of being brothers and sisters in fellowship, the very idea of relating to the opposite sex as something other than a romantic partner, is an unfamiliar idea to lots of young people. I think this explains a lot of the romantic trouble that we're seeing out there. I think the decline in religiosity is also showing up in another area, kind of at the extreme of society. We all know there have been a number of terrible, mass killings in the United States lately. It's almost 20 years ago that I devoted a chapter in a book to examining the biographies of what was then the spate of young killers. And almost invariably, of course, they had family disruption and worse in their backgrounds. This is a very well-known fact in sociology. James Q. Wilson documented it brilliantly in his book On Crime forever ago. It's not that we don't know these facts, it's that we don't want to face them. And the same is true of the people responsible for the latest rounds of atrocities in the United States. Just 2 weeks ago or so, Jack, I wrote a piece for Newsweek looking at what was said by one of these recent killers. He left a note that said, "I have no friends, I have no family."
Right.
This is the breakdown of civil society, and it is coming about not for large political reasons and not because of political polarization. It's coming from a much more elemental place, and that, I think, is what we have to deal with.
Daniel, I was listening to a radio interview you did with, I believe it was a station out in Utah, and you gave what I would call talked about, I'll call a not untypical American upbringing for the last generation, a middle-class home, a child or two, working parents, and the parental prioritizing, although I think you said parental emphasis. They emphasize certain things for children, sports, whatever, ballet, etc., but not worship. So, in your own words, would you talk about this and the consequences regarding worship or even interest in religion for the child as he or she enters adulthood? I mean, we're looking to blame somebody, right? Well, not you, but are parents to blame in part for this increase in religiosity in this America's current young generation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to revert to my first response, and it's extraordinarily complicated. I don't think we actually have that good a handle on the causal mechanisms for religious decline. I think that certainly economic disruption is a huge part of the story, because that was, largely responsible, or at least contributed mightily to this disruption of traditional family life, to marriage rates. Like, I think you can't discount the sort of supreme, economic disruption that we had in some of these working class communities that used to be not that different, right? There used to not be huge class divides on these basic questions of family structure.
Right.
I just had a piece that looked at a really basic formative experience, family dinner, which were much more common a generation ago than it is today, right? If you look at baby boomers, almost all of them said that they grew up having regular family dinners. Now, Gen Z much less likely to do that, but Gen Z raised by college-educated parents are far more likely to have done it than Gen Zers raised by parents without a college education. So again, this basic experience is now socially economically stratified, and you see that across, right? Like two-parent households, all these kind of indicators of familial stability, are now associated with differences in educational background. So I think when it comes to parents making decisions, I think a lot of the emphasis now in middle-class parents and upper middle class on prioritizing these sort of achievement activities, enrichment activities, whether it's art classes, music classes, language classes. I am a parent of young kids, and I've seen any number of listserv of advertising all these different things you can do for your kid. And I think that comes out of a sense of economic insecurity. Even though many families are doing quite well, there's a feeling that you could easily fall back, right? That there's no safety net, there's no one who's really going to look out for you. Therefore, you've got to give your kid every chance to achieve and to be successful. And how do you do that? Well, you sort of funnel them into all these enrichment and achievement activities. And what results is what you end up having really, really successful kids. Gen Z is an incredibly impressive generation, but they're lonely. They have anxiety. They have more mental health issues than at least registered than any other previous generation. And that's part of it. And in that context, I think a lot of, even parents who are both at least nominally, or maybe some are religious, they're downplaying religious activities and religious community in favor of these other activities. And I think that it's a conscious choice, but it's driven by these sort of concerns about economic stability.
Daniel, I'm going to ask you in a couple of minutes to talk about the two pieces you wrote. One is Generation Z and the future of faith in America, and then another is a piece you wrote for National Review, like don't blame Gen Z for what's happened. I think we just lost Mary, so I'm sure Mary will come back. Let me ask you about that now. Let me bring up this National Review piece of yours. And you wrote in it, more Americans today are being raised in secular households than ever before. More than 1 in 7 Gen Zers report that they were not raised in a religious tradition at all. What's more, unlike past generation, most Americans today with no religious attachment in childhood remain unaffiliated as adults. This marks a significant change from the past. So, and more along the same lines. So, there's this Gen Z right now. They're the ones who are unaffiliating. Although I think you may want to spell that first. Is this equal? Is the unaffiliating? Is the becoming a nun? Is it a pace across ages? But talk about that a little bit. But then talk about that piece, the big piece you wrote, Gen Z and the future of faith in America.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's not in dispute is that the formative religious experiences of Gen Z and to a little bit lesser extent millennials were significantly different than previous generations. They were basically far less robust. They were less likely to be attending services with their family growing up, less likely to engage in saying grace at meal times, to do Bible or scripture reading at home, to attend formal education programs, Sunday school, what have you. All these different measures we've asked about, and it's been asked in multiple surveys, and they're all lower. If you look at Gen Z, they're just much less likely than baby boomers and the silent generation to have participated in these activities. And so if you look at the people who are most likely to leave religion, Another thing we know is that it's not some kind of seminal or formative experience with religion that's really negative that you sort of say, you know what, I'm out of here. I don't like this.
Right.
It's more of a drifting away. So who's likely to drift away? Well, people who aren't really tethered that closely to religion in the first place. And that's exactly the people that we see becoming nuns, folks who were never that attached to organized religion or religious community in the first place.
We have a question, Daniel, and I know again, Caitlin is trying to get Mary back on here. There's disruption in her connection. I think this is a question would be on a lot of people's minds. It's from Jonathan Stump. How much has social media played in the decline of the family and loneliness? And I guess we'll say, and the rise of the nuns. Is there a factor there?
Yeah, a lot of people have looked at this, or other broader issues like internet access and the availability of information. And if you look at earliest surveys about how people were using the internet to access religious information, one of the first things they were doing when they got online is to Google, or I guess before it was Google, it was Ask Jeeves or something else. They were looking about information about their own faith, about their own religious tradition, and trying to get a handle on what the theology really says, what they're, kind of fact checking religious leaders, learning about things that they may have not been taught. And so I think one of the things that we started seeing is, the hierarchy of information changed pretty significantly. So religious leaders were not the sole arbiters of all the information, positive or negative, about any particular faith tradition. And I think that really changed things. And I think one of the things you saw beginning in the 90s is a kind of slow and steady deterioration of trust among religious leaders. And I don't think the internet is solely to blame, but I think this shift in the balance of who kind of controls information is really an important part of that story. When it comes specifically to social media, I'm a little bit, if you'll forgive the term, agnostic on how bad it is. I mean, certainly folks have found that it can contribute significantly to a lot of negative outcomes, particularly among young women. But I think a lot of it is in how you use social media. If you're using social media as a replacement to in real life social engagement, that's not a positive or healthy outcome. If you're using it as a kind of a voyeur, so you're just looking at what other people are doing instead of actively posting, engaging. If you're using it to shout at strangers, right? There's a number of different ways you can use it, which is antisocial and not helpful. If you're using it to kind of augment an already active social life, then I actually don't think it's that bad. You talked earlier about the decline in friendship, and I think one of the things that a lot of people might be surprised at is actually or maybe they wouldn't, the number of Americans with close friendships has declined pretty significantly, even as social media took off. So we can maintain, we have easier access of getting in touch with people that we know, but our close friendships at the same time have diminished pretty considerably. And I think that's related to a lot of Putnam's work and others, people who study civil and civic society, that our institutions have been atrophying.
Oh, Daniel, I again, that radio podcast I heard you on, I'm a numbers guy, right? I'm an analysis guy, I'm a data guy, okay. But still, you cover a broad stretch of things, and you must have some, I think, worthwhile thoughts on, in general, religion in civil society, based on the presumption there is a civil society, that it's important in particular to America, given our own history, and that religious communities at a local level, we believe in subsidiarity, have proven vital to civil society, not only as places of worship, but it's through religious institutions that other hospitals, schools, orphanages, etc., have been created. So looking at the future, as you talked about the decline, let's look at the present. What are your thoughts about the state of the influence of the nuns on civil society? do you think it diminishes America as an exceptional thing, or America as it was intended to be by our founders?
Yeah, so I think if you're concerned about the state of discourse of our civic culture, then you're absolutely right to be concerned about the decline of religion. So much of American community life was structured around a place of worship and regular religious participation. We know that that's not really up for debate. It was important in how people built community, established friendships, earned and established trust. They learned how to get along with people who maybe had different political views than they did and perspectives. And it was an institution that supported raising a family, right? And it was one of the only ones that did all these things, right? There's other institutions that do one or two or maybe even three of these things, but few institutions did everything.
Right.
But religious organizations, churches, houses of worship were really critical in that regard. And if you look at any kind of social or civic measure, I mean almost any, and I've looked at a lot, people who regularly involved in a faith community tend to score higher. They have more friends, they are less lonely, they're more engaged in a whole variety of civic activities, from the PTA to a book club, you name it, to a workout group. People who are regularly engaged in religious worship. And that's the key, actually. It's not so much what you believe, it's not so much what church you go to, it's that you go. That is the kind of key thing that we found. It's like regular religious participation is the key element in all of this stuff. So people that are Catholic and never go don't get the same kind of benefit from someone who's Catholic and does go.
Yeah, there was, again, I'm referring now to something I saw you write and refer to. There was a belief that what was at the time called the unchurched was still a value. They're just not going to church, but they're still worshiping in their own, I guess, individual way, in their own, who knows, in their basement, in their home. It seemed to me, I may have misread that, but it was some sort of consoling from the religious community that things aren't really that bad, but maybe they are really that bad. If you're not affiliation and participation is puts things on civil society on a stronger level than being quote unquote unchurched and thinking about God at home. Not that there's anything wrong with that, as they say.
Yeah, and I think we've seen perhaps a move, I don't know if I would call it a trend, towards this kind of personalization of religion, right? That as trust in organized religion has declined, people have said, like, well, I don't necessarily want that, or there are parts of that I don't like, and sort of saying, well, I'll do it on my own, right? I'll do my own thing in my own way. The problem with that is if, as you sort of separate out from the community piece, right, where you're seeing people, you're engaging with religious ideas and beliefs, you're hearing about things regularly, that really kind of affirms identity and belief when it comes to religion. And so if you separate that, what happens, I think, naturally is it kind of atrophies. And so I think belief is in that way a lagging indicator. So it's declining, it's just declining more slowly than affiliation and participation.
I'd like to make a commercial announcement, by the way, and Dane, I'll have a couple other questions. I want to encourage our participants, and I have a few questions here, and I will ask them. Consider going to the American Philanthropic website, that's americanphilanthropic.com, and click on events, and then go down and click on all events, and you'll see the range of forthcoming webinars and seminars that we are sponsoring next month. On December 6th, I have another webinar. It's on the fragility of citizenship, and that's with Victor Davis Hanson and Tony Woodleaf. I really encourage you to participate. And 2 days later, my colleague Jonathan Hanna has a webinar on effective altruism. Is it effective? Is it even altruistic? And then we have a seminar coming up in Phoenix on November 17th through the 19th. And if you're involved in major gifts, or interested in becoming involved in major gifts and fundraising for nonprofits, I heartily recommend you consider attending. So you'll find links to all those at American philanthropic events. So, Daniel, let me ask a question here that fizzing on for, oh my gosh, it's Dr. Anthony Miserandino. And Madonna me, he taught me religion and theology in high school almost 50 years ago. Good professor, good to thank you here. He asks, how much of the nuns' experience is rooted in the loss of trust in all social institutions? They are seeking community in a number of places, just not traditional places. Is there some, are they finding it in the local bar? I don't think there's a book about bowling alone, so I don't think they're finding it in the bowling alley. But what are your thoughts on that, Daniel? What's your answer to Professor Dr. Miserandino?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important question. And, I say this as a pollster, I don't know if we currently have good measures of the demand of for spiritual belonging or engagement, really, that I think there is a healthy demand for these things. And if you ask about, searches, to the extent that people are searching for meaning and belonging, and to the extent that they value these things, yes, I mean, we hear that. You hear that in focus groups and interviews, and some of the questions that we ask. But I think it's hard to know, because the thing that I think people are wanting doesn't quite exist, right? That there's maybe some I'm talking about for the non-religious folks now, there might be some version of a church community that they would be really amenable to going to. And I think that thing just doesn't exist yet. So where are they going? Or they're going to bookstores, doing book clubs, they're going to coffee shops, parks. The outdoor spaces are, if you look at the behavior of Gen Z, incredibly important. We've done surveys on third places, which is the kind of institutions between home and work, and coffee shops and outdoor spaces like parks, community gardens, all really, really popular among young people. And I think it's because they provide sort of meaning and a activity and the feeling of belonging. You can have the regular folks that you see there, yoga groups outside, that kind of thing. It was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I wrote this piece for my newsletter on whether coffee shops could replace religion. And I didn't seriously mean that would happen, but I think for people who are not religious or don't want sort of the traditional religious experience, whether there is a substitute that could fill, if not all the things that one gets from church or a place of worship, they could fulfill some of it. And whether something like a coffee shop could in some iteration do that.
Can we talk about the decline, the rise of the nuns on all fronts, and looking at it from a per religion perspective, Catholics, Christians, and Jews? Not that Catholics aren't Christians, but there is a difference in some of the info I've seen that I think you've written about. So it just seems to be more pronounced, the becoming a nun based on whether you're a Catholic, Protestant, or Jew. Could you break them out? And then I want to talk to you a little separately about a piece written for AEI on, I think the numbers of the American Jewish community on this are really striking.
Yeah, so I think one of the most important trends when it comes to religious disaffiliation and what happens over the life course, I think Mary was alluding to this a little bit, that religion was really important at various stages. Growing up, it provided community. When you got married, it was really important. Like there was a community that to sort of celebrate that union and come together and sort of help this new couple, this new family, and then raising kids, right? These sort of seminal life events, and of course, death is the last one. And I think at all these stages, religion was really, really important traditionally, and I think for when you look at how young people are navigating these things, they're just at every stage they're kind of giving up, like they may not raise children at all, or they may raise them outside church. And in fact, we've asked questions about how important is it to raise children in a religious tradition to so that they can learn good values. And most young people disagree with that. And we can get into this a little bit if you want.
Sure.
But we,
Go ahead.
we need to talk about the politicization of religion, and the fact that it's not that there are no models of living a religious life or a Christian life out there. It's one of the problems is some of the models are not really that good. So when you see someone on Twitter and the first thing they identify is a Christian or a believer in Jesus, and they're swearing and saying all manner of really kind of negative stuff about people that they don't even know. Well, if I'm not raised in a Christian home, if I don't have that many friends who are Christian, which a lot of people who aren't religious don't have that many close connections to people who are, that's a really important data point for me to understand, like, wow, I guess this is what Christians are about. I guess this is how they engage in public debate. And so I think that is such an important piece of all this, that, in political science, right? Like, one of the things that we learned early on is that political beliefs, political engagement comes from religion, right? Our organizing beliefs come from theology, religious practice, all that stuff is upstream from our political views. But
Right.
now there's a wave of political science research that shows, well, actually, a lot of that's not true, that a lot of religious identity and values is downstream from politics. Like,
Yeah.
politics is the thing that is the animating driver of this stuff. And I think that is something that we've been kind of slow to really make sense of, and how it's impacting perceptions of a whole variety of different types of religions and organized religion overall.
I want to keep. By the way, Tomas Bednarik has asked a couple of questions, and I'm just going to put out one, and I think it was more for Mary. And Mary's hotel Wi-Fi has totally crapped out, so this is we'll ride this into the sunset, you and me, Daniel. He was asking about the 1956 book by Peter Sorokin, The American Sex Revolution. I don't want to ask you about it if you've never read it. Do you know anything about this, Daniel?
I have not read it.
No, then we'll move on to his second question. How to explain the fact, and this is a little more political, how to explain the fact that states such as Idaho, Montana, and probably Wyoming are, on the one hand, quite non-religious. There is a large percentage of non-religious people there. And then, on the other hand, or at least were, quite conservative when it comes to voting results. Is there anything, based on what you were just talking about, is there any, religiosity and conservatism, or a lack of religiosity and liberalism? I mean, there's some data to that point. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting observation. Going back to I think it was in 2002, a pair of sociologists were the first ones to identify that liberals and moderates were far more likely to disaffiliate from religion than conservatives. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I think an obvious one was that if you look at the political positions taken by a lot of particularly Christian denominations, they tended to be against same-sex marriage or premarital sex, cohabitation. They're more traditionally minded on gender roles. Some had pretty negative views and of LGBTQ people, and I think, again, that's part of what's in the mix. Like, that, for most people, I think people would say that's a very small part, and for them, not a very relevant part of their faith. But from the outside, or from the periphery, that is what is seen. That is what is internalized when the loudest voices in the room say, "I'm Christian and I believe this. This is the most important thing for me. It's abortion. It's gay marriage." Right? That becomes the defining element and the brand, quite frankly, of that denomination or that tradition. And you've actually seen people write books on this. And there's actually a campaign. I think it's a $100 million campaign that, based on some market research, and they found that people actually liked Jesus but didn't like a lot of what his followers were doing. And I think that goes to the same point, that sort of there's a perception problem. And I think some of it's based in reality. And I think it's something that, for those who really care about the continued vitality of organized religion or their own denomination. It's something that needs to be addressed.
Daniel, I want to get back to that question by the article raised by Samuel Abrams, and then I have another question or two about causality. But Samuel Abrams wrote a piece for AEI titled Jews and the Faith of Their Children. And here's what he wrote in part. American Jews are unique to the extent they believe it is not that important for children to grow up in a faith. Only 51% of Jews support the notion that children should grow up with a religious faith so they can learn good values. Roughly as many disagree. 17% of Jews today completely reject the notion that faith provides some moral background for their children and development. Is that particularly, is the Jewish component of the becoming nuns head and shoulders above others? Or is that kind of striking data, or is this, you've seen this before, this is a trend? What's your thoughts about what your colleague wrote?
Yeah, Sam Abrams is a friend, a collaborator, and a colleague of mine, and he is certainly the expert here, not me. But I don't think there's a lot of great data on the disaffiliation rates across some of these smaller traditions. So a lot of surveys, Jewish Americans account for 1 or 2% of the adult population. So in your average survey of 1,000 people, there's not much you can do to identify, what's happening. You don't have a large enough sample. I will say that, compared to a lot of other traditions, Jews are much more liberal. And I think part of that is, again, politics coming in, that because Jewish Americans are liberal, they're pro-choice, largely supportive of same-sex marriage, and have much more they have much more modern views when it comes to a whole variety of gender roles and other things. And I think that is running into some of these ideas on, what organized religion means, what it means to be attached to a religious community. So I think that's part of what's going on. I don't know if I'm gonna how Sam, he's gonna call me up after and say, no, I got this all wrong. Well, but I think that's at least part of the story.
We have a link to his article so people can read it for themselves. Two questions on causality, and then we'll wrap it up. Of course, and then I want to ask you again about civil society, but as for the becoming a nun, meaning essentially none of the above, it's different than just becoming non-practicing, I think, right? I'm a Catholic, I don't go to church. Well, I'm not checking none of the above, right? I may be adding less to the flourishing of civil society, but I'm not a nun. Still, I'm wondering, I'm church going, and boy, oh boy, when you came back after COVID, it wasn't that, the attendance wasn't that great before COVID, and it's kind of like, wow, you could shoot grape shot through this church and not hit anybody. Did COVID have, in your view, any impact on the nuns and the increase in the nuns?
Well, that's a really fortuitous question. We just got data back from a study in which we interviewed folks back in, I think, like 2018, 2019. And then we re-interviewed the same folks in the spring of 2022. And we asked them these exact questions. What was your affiliation then and now? What is your religious attendance then and now? And at the risk of getting crosswise with my media folks,
I'm sorry.
I will leak a little bit of info here. So we did see a decline, and it's hard to know exactly, is it entirely due to the pandemic or other forces? Because we can't say with any certainty that it was expressly the pandemic that did this. Could it be something that was, something downstream of the pandemic? There were some churches that shuttered, but my instinct is that the pandemic probably played a role in a pretty significant reduction in religious attendance, not identity, just attendance.
Attendance, okay. And one other cause, you mentioned earlier that, it's very hard to really find the causality for all of this, but I've read somewhere, of course I've lost my note, one report that claims that people are becoming nuns because they find that Christianity rejects science or is quote unquote anti-science. So is that it's one thing that people are PO that, Roman Catholicism is anti-abortion, and that has an American political aspect to it. So these things become, all tied up together. But is anti-science some explanation for none of the above?
Yeah, I mean, I think people who say that they're not religious because it's anti-science, there's probably, 4 or 5 different things that they object to as well. And the science thing is just one among them. I mean, we haven't talked about it, but I think if I'm trying to get a handle on what has been among the most damaging things for particular traditions in general, but organized religion overall,
Right.
is the sex abuse scandals, and particularly the response to sex abuse scandals.
Yeah.
I don't think there's been anything that has undermined the credibility of religious leaders more than the unwillingness or the inability of churches and houses of worship to address it. These allegations of sex abuse committed by those in positions of authority, and particularly religious authority. So I think in a single generation, clergy went from being the most trusted and ethical leaders in society to being seen as about as trustworthy as your average auto mechanic. And that's data. That's based on Gallup data, that they are about as trusted as auto mechanics right now. So, wow. And in the wake of the global Catholic sex abuse scandal that came to light in the early 2000s, we saw a direct correlation with trust in organized religion and religious leaders. And so I think, that was just incredibly damaging. And now we're seeing the same thing unfolding in various Protestant denominations. One of the highest profile now is the stuff going on with SBC. And I think people are starting to get a handle on what the repercussions of this. And one study found that 1 in 10 Protestants have left the church over how it handled allegations of sexual misconduct. So again, I think these things are so damaging, particularly for people who are already more at the periphery and are less tied to the community. So for people who are just in it for the long term, I think they'll ride it out. They'll find a new place, or they'll try to help address problems in that church or the denomination. But people on the periphery, I think they're gone. I think that's what we're going to see for places, depending on how this all shakes out. But for young people in particular, this is what they don't know as much. They don't have as long history to draw on. So this is what they're hearing about. This is what's in the news. This is what they may be facing when they attend. So I think that's a really critical part of this whole story.
We have just about 2 minutes left, Daniel. I'm going to put you on the spot. I think and Mary is going to be sending in, she sees some questions. She's going to be trying to send some emails around. We'll send emails to those folks who participate, and we thank you for participating. Again, I thank my colleagues for helping out today. But we believe there are nuns. We believe there is, this is a trend. The trend is getting worse, depending on your perspective. From my perspective, worse. And it has consequence for civil society. It has weakened civil society and will continue to weaken civil society, as you say, from your studies that show what trends are predicting 20 years from now. Is there anything is there anything positive to say? Is there anything that you've seen in not only your research, but in any other work you've done that shows that there is hope for reinvigorating religious communities somehow or other in America? And I ask you about positive because of their central role to civil society.
Yeah, so I do think there's some positive news. I know I've probably been more of a storm cloud than a rainbow here today, but when you look at the totality of American religion, it's an incredibly vibrant religious place. It's diverse. I mean, one of the things that is remarkable about the American religious context is we're so diverse, but actually, we may have very virulent political divisions, but when it comes to religion, we tend to get along fairly well. We have, fairly high rates of religious intermarriage. Americans tend to have friends and colleagues from different faiths. So in that way, America has really embraced the idea of religious pluralism and diversity in a way that I think is extraordinarily positive. This is not necessarily as positive, but one of the things that I just want to put an exclamation point on is, Mary mentioned this earlier, that we're increasingly seeing an education divide in religious attendance, with college educated folks attending more frequently than those without. And that's one of the huge problems we're having with the growing sort of class division we have in the US, is that religious organizations were incredibly powerful social and civic equalizers. They function the same for low-income communities as they did for high-income communities. They connected people, provided social and sometimes financial support. And a generation ago, Americans with a college degree were just likely to be in the pews every Sunday as those in lower-income communities, and that's no longer the case. And so we're seeing the kind of downstream. It's not the only reason, but it's one reason why we're seeing the sort of social and civic deterioration among working class folks is because nothing has really moved in to fill in the space of church and worship.
Okay. Well, that's not so rainbowy, but it was still worth sharing. We have to face the realities before we can fix things or see that the ways to strengthen our civil society. So, hey, Daniel, I want to thank you very much for doing this, participating. Mary, for the time you were here, and I know again Mary's hotel Wi-Fi just totally collapsed. So but glad we had her for a little bit for the wisdom she shared. I want to quickly again, please, folks, go visit American Philanthropics website. Hope to see you at future webinars. Save the date for our conference in November 7th and 8th out in Scottsdale, 2023. Mr. Misrandino, was great to see you even through social media 45 years later. And to all who participated, thank you very much. And we'll be back on December 6th with our next webinar on the fragility of citizenship. So thanks very much. God bless all.